The Galactic Court loomed above the fabric of space like a colossal monument to civilization's ambition. Its crystalline walls shimmered with shifting hues, reflecting the light of distant stars, while a ceaseless hum of energy coursed through its structure. Delegates from across the galaxy filled the vast chamber, their forms as varied as the worlds they hailed from, feathered, scaled, metallic, and more. At the heart of this magnificent chaos stood a solitary figure, distinctly human, dwarfed not only by the grandeur of the court, but also by the task before him. David Vance adjusted the cuffs of his plain black suit, the only attire he owned that might convey the gravity of the occasion. His face, lined with age and weariness, betrayed no hint of the turmoil within. He scanned the assembly with sharp, calculating eyes, meeting the gazes of alien delegates who regarded him with everything from curiosity to contempt. His hands, though steady, gripped the edges of the podium as if anchoring him to this moment. He was not here for himself. He was here for humanity. The summons had come weeks ago, delivered not by messenger, but through an emergency transmission that crackled to life in the stillness of his modest aside office. The voice on the other end, a government official whose name he hadn't bothered to remember, spoke of unspeakable atrocities committed by the alien empire against a human colony on Alpha Centauri. 50,000 lives, wiped out in an instant by orbital bombardment, the survivors left to sift through ashes. The Galactic Court had agreed to hear humanity's case, a rare and dangerous opportunity. For the court was no impartial arbiter, but a theater where politics and power danced on the edge of law. David had almost refused. He was no longer the man he once was, the firebrand lawyer who had swayed Earth's most stubborn juries with his eloquence and empathy. Time had dulled his edges, and grief had hollowed him. But as the official's words painted a picture of the massacre, he'd thought of his brother's family, lost in the chaos of the colony's fall. By the time the transmission ended, he had already made his decision. Now, standing in the court's oppressive glow, David felt the weight of countless eyes on him. His role was clear: to prosecute King Xyler, sovereign of the alien empire, for crimes against humanity. The odds of success, he knew, were infinitesimal. The empire's influence stretched across the galaxy, its wealth and military might unmatched. The judges themselves, an eclectic mix of alien dignitaries, were either in the empire's pocket or too steeped in their own species' biases to care about human suffering. Still, David had one advantage, one that no other species could fully grasp: the uniquely human capacity to wield justice not as a tool of survival, but as a shield for dignity. A chime echoed through the chamber, signaling the start of proceedings. The hum of conversation subsided, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. From a side entrance, King Xyler entered, his imposing figure draped in ornate, shimmering robes that reflected the cold light of the court. His insectoid features, framed by a crown of razor-like appendages, betrayed no emotion as he took his place at the defendant's stand. His advisors flanked him, their expressions inscrutable but their postures radiating confidence. David resisted the urge to clench his fists. Xyler's presence was a reminder of everything humanity had lost. The king's calm demeanor was a calculated insult, a message that he did not fear this trial or its outcome. But David had not come here to be intimidated. He had come to fight. The first phase of the trial was procedural, a recitation of charges and formalities that David barely registered. His focus was on the evidence he had painstakingly assembled: satellite footage of the bombardment, intercepted transmissions implicating Xyler, and the harrowing testimonies of survivors. It wasn't enough to merely present these facts. He would have to craft a narrative so compelling, so irrefutable, that even the most biased judges would be forced to acknowledge its truth. As the formalities concluded, the presiding judge, a gelatinous being with a voice like grinding stones, turned its gaze toward David. "Human advocate, you may present your case." David stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension coiled in his chest. "Honorable judges, esteemed delegates, I stand before you not merely as a representative of Earth, but as a voice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. 50,000 men, women, and children, innocent lives, were extinguished in an act of calculated cruelty. This is not a matter of politics or territory. It is a matter of justice. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembly. The silence that followed was palpable, broken only by the faint hum of the court's energy field. David continued, his tone firm but measured. The evidence I will present today will leave no doubt as to the responsibility of King Xyler and the empire he leads. But beyond the evidence lies a question that each of you must answer. Do we, as a galactic community, value justice enough to hold the powerful accountable? Or do we allow the cries of the powerless to fade into oblivion? From the corner of his eye, David caught a flicker of movement. Commander Darius Peters, seated among the witnesses, nodded subtly. Peters was one of the few survivors of the Alpha Centauri massacre and David's key witness. The commander's rugged features bore the scars of battle, and his presence was a reminder of the resilience humanity still possessed. Their brief exchange was enough to steel David's resolve. The court's proceedings moved forward, the prosecution and defense sparring over preliminary evidence. Xyler's legal team, a trio of alien lawyers with unsettlingly smooth voices, sought to discredit the accusations, framing the massacre as a regrettable but necessary action in a territorial dispute. Their arguments were laced with condescension, dismissing humanity as a minor species unworthy of galactic concern. David listened impassively, his mind racing as he prepared his rebuttal. When his turn came, he stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. Regrettable actions do not include targeting civilian populations. Necessary measures do not involve the systematic annihilation of unarmed innocents. What the Empire calls a territorial dispute, we call genocide. As he spoke, he projected images onto the central display. Charred buildings, lifeless landscapes, and the faces of those who had suffered and survived. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes. Xyler remained still, his expression unreadable. But David noticed a slight twitch in the king's mandibles, a crack in the facade. The session ended with the court adjourning for deliberation on procedural matters. David returned to his seat, exhaustion threatening to overtake him. Peters leaned in, his voice low. "You're holding your ground, but they're not going to make this easy." "They never do," David replied, his gaze fixed on the distant figure of King Xyler. "But this isn't about what's easy. It's about what's right." As the chamber emptied, David allowed himself a moment to breathe. The road ahead was long, fraught with obstacles and uncertainty. But in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope, a small but vital spark. The fight had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the next session began. The gathered alien delegates watching with a mix of indifference and intrigue. David Van stood at the center of the circular arena, a lone figure dwarfed by the towering, crystalline structures that pulsed faintly with energy. This was the moment he had prepared for, a chance to do the impossible, to hold the alien empire accountable for their atrocities. He tightened his grip on the edge of the podium, drawing strength from the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. The presiding judge's gelatinous form rippled slightly as it spoke, its gravelly voice filling the chamber. "Human advocate, you may proceed with your argument. Present your evidence, and let the court determine its merit." David inclined his head in acknowledgement, his face a mask of composure. But inside, a storm raged. He knew what was at stake. The fate of humanities standing in the galactic community rested on his shoulders. He began slowly, deliberately, his voice carrying a gravity that demanded attention. "Honorable judges, esteemed delegates," he started, his gaze sweeping across the assembly, lingering just long enough to unsettle those who met his eyes. "We are here not merely to discuss a tragedy, but to confront a crime that strikes at the very heart of what binds all civilizations together, the principle of justice. What occurred on Alpha Centauri was not an unfortunate accident or an unavoidable consequence of conflict. It was a deliberate, calculated act of genocide, sanctioned by King Xyler and executed with ruthless precision. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some delegates whispering to one another in their native tongues. David let the silence settle before continuing, raising his hand to activate the central display. A holographic image materialized in the air, a sprawling, vibrant human colony, its towers reaching toward the stars, its people bustling with life and purpose. The image froze, and then it shifted, replaced by the aftermath of the massacre. Smoke choked the sky. Craters marred the ground, and the colony lay in ruins. The silence in the courtroom grew deafening, the images a stark testament to the devastation. David's voice dropped, quieter now, but sharper, like the edge of a blade. 50,000 lives, fathers, mothers, children, erased in an instant. The Empire claims this was a military necessity, a regrettable collateral event. I will prove otherwise. He gestured again, and the display shifted to a series of intercepted communications. Here, he said, his voice rising, is an order issued directly from King Xyler's command. The human colony is to be annihilated completely. No survivors. Let it serve as a warning. Gasps erupted across the chamber. Even the most jaded delegates shifted in their seats, the weight of the evidence pulling their attention. David pressed forward, his momentum building. I ask you, he continued, his tone unwavering, what warning justifies the slaughter of children? What strategic gain excuses the obliteration of unarmed civilians? These are not questions of politics or territory. They are questions of morality, of decency. And the answers are clear. From the witness stand, Commander Darius Peters watched, his jaw set like stone. The scars across his face seemed to deepen in the dim light, his presence a living reminder of the massacre's toll. David turned to him, his voice softening slightly. Commander Peters, he said, you were there. You witnessed what happened. Tell this court what you saw. Darius stood, his military uniform a stark contrast to the opulence of the alien delegates. His voice was steady but heavy with emotion. I was stationed on Alpha Centauri, he began, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. I saw the ships descend, their weapons tearing through our defenses. We didn't stand a chance. They targeted everything. Homes, hospitals, schools. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. The commander paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I pulled a child from the rubble, he continued, his voice thick. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her name was Layla. She asked me if her parents were safe. I couldn't answer her because I knew the truth. There was no one left. David let the words hang in the air, their weight settling over the courtroom like a shroud. He turned back to the judges, his expression unreadable. This is not merely an account of destruction, he said. It is a testament to cruelty. The defense rose then, their lead counsel, a tall, sinewy alien with a metallic sheen to its skin, approaching the central podium. Its voice was smooth and melodic, yet its words carried a venomous undertone. The Empire regrets the loss of life, it began, inclining its head with feigned solemnity. But let us not forget that the humans encroached on sovereign territory. They refused to comply with our warnings. The events on Alpha Centauri, while tragic, were the inevitable result of their defiance. David felt the heat rise in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. The defense's argument was predictable, and he had prepared for it. When his turn came to respond, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the defense's polished rhetoric. I expected this line of reasoning, he said, his tone sharp. Blaming the victims is a convenient strategy when you cannot justify your actions. But the evidence is clear. This was not a territorial dispute. It was a massacre, and no amount of deflection can change that. He turned back to the display, calling up the intercepted transmission once more. This order, he said, pointing to the incriminating text, was given before any supposed warnings were issued. The intent was always genocide, and the evidence proves it. For a moment, The courtroom was silent. Even King Xyler, who had remained impassive throughout, shifted slightly in his seat. David seized the opportunity, his voice rising with conviction. "Honorable judges," he said, "humanity may be a young species. We may lack the wealth, the power, the influence of the great empires represented here. But we share something that transcends species, something that unites all sentient beings: the belief that life has value. If we allow this crime to go unpunished, we undermine that belief. We tell the galaxy that power is the only arbiter of justice, and we pave the way for more atrocities." He paused, his gaze locking onto the judges one by one. "I ask you not to rule for humanity alone. I ask you to rule for the principle of justice, for the dignity of all who call this galaxy home." As he stepped back, the chamber buzzed with quiet conversation, the delegates clearly affected by his words. But David knew the battle was far from over. The judges' biases ran deep, and the Empire's influence loomed large. Still, for the first time, he saw a crack in the facade, a glimmer of doubt in the eyes of those who would decide humanity's fate. The session adjourned with the presiding judge announcing a recess for deliberation. David returned to his seat, his hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed. Darius leaned over, his voice low. "They felt that," the commander said, his tone laced with cautious optimism. David nodded, though his expression remained somber. "We've shaken them," he replied. "But whether they act on it is another matter entirely." As the delegates filed out of the chamber, David allowed himself a single fleeting thought. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted, a subtle but undeniable change that David could feel in the air. The murmur of voices was quieter now, the alien delegates less animated in their private discussions. Even the judges seemed more attentive, their alien forms tilting forward slightly as if to catch every word. The weight of David's argument had begun to press against the walls of the Galactic Court, but the struggle for justice was far from over. David stood once more at the central podium, the hollow ache of exhaustion gnawing at him. The holographic displays that had carried his evidence still hovered in the air, flickering faintly as if uncertain whether to vanish or remain. He glanced briefly at Commander Peters, who gave him a firm nod from his seat. Peters's silent strength anchored him, a reminder that this fight was not his alone. "Honorable judges," David began, his voice steady despite the turmoil roiling within him, "we have presented the evidence. The facts are irrefutable. King Xyler ordered the annihilation of Alpha Centauri's colony, targeting civilians with no provocation. The defense has attempted to disguise this atrocity as a necessary act, but their arguments crumble under the weight of truth. Now, I will ask you to consider not only what has been done, but what it means if we fail to act." As he spoke, David felt the resistance in the room, a stubborn, almost tangible force. He knew what he was up against. Many of the delegates had no love for humanity, viewing his species as an upstart in the galactic hierarchy. Others, swayed by the Empire's influence, saw this trial as a mere formality, a charade to placate those demanding justice. But David also saw something else in their eyes, faint and fleeting: doubt. He turned to the defense's lead counsel, who stood poised with the cold precision of a predator. "The Empire claims that this trial is a farce," David said, his tone sharp. "They argue that humanity is weak, irrelevant, unworthy of the court's time, but their desperation to bury the truth reveals otherwise. If we were truly insignificant, they would not fear this trial. They would not need to twist the narrative, to conceal their guilt. They fear us because they know that justice, once spoken, cannot be silenced." The defense counsel stepped forward, its metallic sheen gleaming under the chamber's light. Its voice was as smooth and cutting as ever. "Human advocate," it said, its tone dripping with disdain, "you speak of justice as if it is a universal constant. But justice, like power, belongs to those who can wield it. The Empire has wielded its power responsibly, maintaining order across the galaxy for centuries. Your species, on the other hand, clings to primitive notions of morality, failing to understand the complexities of interstellar governance. The courtroom fell silent as the council's words hung in the air. David felt a flicker of anger rise within him, but he quelled it, allowing a moment of quiet before he responded. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the defense counsel's unblinking gaze. "Power without accountability is tyranny," David said, his voice rising with quiet intensity. "Order maintained through fear is not stability. It is oppression. The Empire's claim to responsibility is a hollow justification for its crimes. And the notion that justice belongs only to the powerful is not merely wrong. It is dangerous. It threatens the foundation of this court and everything it stands for." He paused, letting his words echo through the chamber. "If we accept that the powerful are above the law, then we condemn every species in this galaxy to live under the shadow of oppression. Today, it is humanity that suffers. Tomorrow, it could be any of you." The delegates shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging uneasy glances. Even the presiding judge seemed to hesitate, its gelatinous form pulsing faintly, as if processing the implications. David pressed forward, sensing the moment beginning to tilt in his favor. "I ask you to look beyond species, beyond politics," he continued. "I ask you to remember why this court exists. It is not to serve the interests of the strong, but to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that no crime, no matter how great, goes unpunished. This is not just humanity's fight. It is a fight for the very soul of justice." The defense counsel opened its mouth to respond, but before it could speak, a voice rang out from the gallery. "This is absurd." A delegate, his reptilian features contorted in anger, stood abruptly. "Humanity oversteps its bounds. They claim the moral high ground, while contributing nothing to the galactic community. Why should we risk conflict with the Empire for their sake?" David turned to face the delegate, his expression calm but resolute. "You ask why you should risk conflict," he said. "I ask why you are willing to tolerate atrocity. If we allow genocide to go unpunished, we do not avoid conflict, we invite it. We send a message to every tyrant, every warmonger, that they may act with impunity as long as they wield enough power. Is that the legacy you wish to leave behind?" The delegate hesitated, his anger faltering under the weight of David's words. The courtroom fell silent once more, the tension thick enough to cut. David turned back to the judges, his voice softening. "I know that this is not an easy decision. The Empire is powerful, its reach vast. But justice has never been easy. It demands courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand against those who would seek to destroy it. I believe that this court has that courage." As he stepped back, the presiding judge gestured for the defense to present its final argument. The Empire's counsel rose, delivering a polished speech that dismissed David's claims as emotional appeals, unworthy of serious consideration. But as the counsel spoke, David saw the cracks beginning to widen. The delegates' expressions were no longer entirely dismissive. Some looked thoughtful, others troubled. When the defense finished, the presiding judge announced a recess for deliberation. David returned to his seat, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the trial. Peters leaned over, his voice low. "You struck a nerve," the commander said. "They're starting to listen." David nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "It's not enough to make them listen," he replied. "We have to make them act." As the courtroom emptied, David allowed himself a moment to breathe. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. The verdict hung in the air like the charged silence before a storm. The presiding judge's amorphous form pulsed faintly as it prepared to deliver its ruling. The gathered delegates leaned forward in anticipation, their collective energy a volatile mix of apprehension, curiosity, and unease. David stood motionless at his podium, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Commander Peters sat stiffly, his steely gaze fixed on the judges, as though sheer will alone could influence their decision. Finally, the judge's voice resonated through the chamber, its guttural tones weaving through the air. The Galactic Court, having reviewed all evidence and arguments presented, delivers its judgment. The word seemed to stretch endlessly, and David held his breath. King Xyler is found guilty of genocide and crimes against sentient life. The sentence is death, to be carried out immediately. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Some delegates roared their approval, their voices rising above the din. Others shouted in protest, their outrage reverberating across the vast chamber. The Empire's representatives stood frozen, their metallic skin glinting like shields against the collective gaze of the court. The presiding judge slammed an appendage against its podium, sending a resonant shockwave that silenced the uproar. "This decision is final," the judge declared, its tone brooking no dissent. "The Empire is hereby ordered to disband its current ruling structure and establish a reparations council to address the harm inflicted upon the human colony." David exhaled sharply, the weight of months, no years, of preparation suddenly lifting. Yet the victory was not as sweet as he had imagined. The cost of justice, he knew, was never light. King Xyler, restrained in an energy field, was brought forward to face the court. His towering, insectoid form was imposing even in captivity, and his multifaceted eyes burned with hatred as they locked onto David. "You may have won this trial," Xyler hissed, his voice a low rasp, "but you have doomed your species. The Empire does not forget." David met his gaze without flinching. "And humanity does not forgive," he replied. "Not until justice is served." The execution was carried out swiftly and without ceremony. The energy field surrounding Xyler intensified, engulfing him in a searing light before collapsing inward. When it dissipated, there was nothing left of the former ruler. The courtroom was silent, the gravity of the moment settling heavily upon all present. As the session adjourned, delegates began filing out, some casting furtive glances at David. He felt their eyes on him, but chose not to react. This was not a moment for celebration. It was a beginning, not an end. Peters approached, his heavy boots echoing against the polished floor. "You did it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Against all odds, you did it." David shook his head, his expression weary. "We did it, Darius. Humanity did it. But this is only the first step. The galaxy won't forget what happened here today, and neither will the Empire. They'll come for us eventually." Peters's jaw tightened. "Let them try. We'll be ready." Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Human survivors and advocates who had gathered to witness the trial erupted into cheers as David and Peters emerged. Some reached out to clasp David's hand, their eyes brimming with gratitude. Others wept openly, the weight of long-buried grief finally given an outlet. For a moment, David allowed himself to bask in their relief, their joy. It was a reminder of why he had fought so hard. Amid the crowd, a young girl stepped forward, her small hand clutching a tattered photograph. She couldn't have been more than 10, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of awe and sadness. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice trembling. David knelt before her, his heart heavy. "We've taken a big step," he said gently, "but safety is something we'll have to keep fighting for." Together, the girl nodded solemnly, clutching her photograph tighter. David rose, his resolve hardening. This victory had come at a cost, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But humanity had proven something today, not just to the galaxy, but to itself. They had stood against unimaginable odds and demanded justice, not for power or revenge, but for dignity. As the crowd began to disperse, Peters leaned in close. "You know they're not going to let this go, right?" he said, his voice low. David nodded. "I know, but we've shown the galaxy what we stand for. We've shown them that justice isn't just a human concept, it's a universal one. And now, they know we're not afraid to demand it." Back aboard their ship, the Aegis, the weight of the day began to settle over David. The quiet hum of the engines was a stark contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. He stood in the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. Peters joined him, a silent presence at his side. "What happens now?" Peters asked after a long silence. David didn't turn away from the viewport. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We hold them to their promises of reparations. And we prepare, because the Empire isn't finished with us. Not yet." Peters grunted in agreement. "And you? What about you?" David finally turned to face him, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'll keep fighting," he said, "because this isn't just about humanity. It's about proving that no matter how small or powerless a species might seem, they can stand up to the giants of the galaxy and demand to be heard." Peters clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "You've got my sword, advocate, wherever this fight takes us." David nodded, his gaze returning to the stars. They were free now, in a way they hadn't been before. Free to define their place in the galaxy, to shape their own destiny. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. Humanity's voice had been heard, and it would not be silenced. In the distance, the stars shimmered, each one a reminder of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead.